Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, subtle at first, easy to ignore, but as time went on, they became impossible to overlook. The woman I had sworn to spend my life with no longer felt like the same person. Or maybe she was, and I had simply never truly understood her to begin with. It wasn't a sudden revelation. There was no catastrophic argument, no single moment of betrayal that shattered everything. Instead, it was a gradual unraveling, like the slow erosion of sand by the tide, until one day I realized the foundation beneath me was gone. In the beginning, we had been inseparable. We had our own world, inside jokes, whispered conversations in the dark, small rituals that made life feel significant. But as time passed, something changed. Or maybe, in her eyes, I hadn't changed enough. At first, the differences were almost too small to notice. A half-hearted chuckle at a joke she once adored. A distracted, yeah, okay, when I shared something about my day. She began dressing differently, speaking differently, surrounding herself with a new crowd. I wanted to be supportive. Growth is natural, isn't it? People evolve, adapt. Maybe I was the one refusing to move forward. Then came the criticisms. You should update your style. Why do you talk like that? It's so bland. Ever thought about changing your hair? You've looked the same for years. I brushed it off. Marriage was about compromise, wasn't it? If she wanted me to refine my look, what harm was there? If she wished I carried myself with a little more polish, I could make the effort. I convinced myself she was just pushing me to be better, but I was wrong. It wasn't about improvement. It was about me no longer being enough. She began creating distance. When she had plans with her ambitious new friends, she went alone. At a dinner party, I overheard her telling someone I was working late, while I was right there. When I confronted her, she sighed, looking at me with a mixture of pity and impatience. Image matters, she said. People judge, you wouldn't understand. That one cut deep. And then came the moment everything clicked. We had been invited to a small gathering, nothing extravagant, just some of her old college acquaintances. I was eager to go, to be part of her world, to meet the people she valued. But when I told her I'd be joining, she hesitated. It was brief, barely a pause, but I caught it. Then she exhaled, as if weighing her words before saying, I just think it'd be better if I went alone. She needed to make the right impression, and I, apparently, didn't fit the image she wanted to present. That was it. That was the moment. No dramatic showdown, no tearful goodbye. Just that single sentence. I was no longer a partner. I was an inconvenience. She wasn't trying to fix things. She wasn't hoping to reconnect. She had already decided I didn't belong in her life anymore. She just hadn't said it outright yet. But if she thought I would quietly fade away, let her cast me aside like an outdated accessory, she was mistaken. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't argue. I didn't demand explanations. I just nodded, watching her walk away, letting her words settle deep inside me. But something inside me shifted that night. The moment she dismissed me as someone unworthy, someone she couldn't be seen with, I stopped seeing her as my wife. She thought she had won, that she could erase me, repackage herself into some polished version where I no longer existed. Fine. If she was so desperate to impress her new circle, I'd make sure they got a performance they wouldn't forget. Confronting her wouldn't be enough. I needed something bigger. She had spent years crafting her image, carefully curating the illusion of perfection, surrounding herself with people who only saw what she wanted them to see. But she had overlooked one thing. The higher you climb, the further you have to fall. And I was going to be the one to push her over the edge. I started gathering my arsenal. I combed through memories, recalling every time she had mocked these very people behind closed doors. The snide remarks, the gossip, the biting criticisms she had made when she thought no one was listening. She had worked so hard to claw her way up this artificial social hierarchy, but she had forgotten one fundamental truth: hypocrisy never stays hidden forever. I opened Facebook and found the event page for the gathering. This wasn't just a casual reunion. It was an exclusive, meticulously curated affair, a stage for old acquaintances to flaunt their success. The guest list was full of names I recognized from stories she had once told me, people she used to ridicule, people she had called shallow, desperate, and fake. And now she was desperate for their approval. The irony was almost poetic. I clicked the RSVP button. She may have insisted that I stay away, but that decision was never hers to make. And I had no intention of merely making an appearance. I would ensure that by the time the evening ended, every single person in that room would see her exactly as I did. The days leading up to the event were spent in meticulous preparation, not just mentally fortifying myself, but planning every detail to perfection. Throwing a tantrum would be foolish. That would only make me appear petty, insignificant. No, this called for precision. I analyzed how she expected me to act: polished, restrained, inconspicuous. So I would do the opposite. I would be bold, unapologetic, impossible to ignore. I would sidestep their shallow pleasantries, guide conversations into discomfort, and dismantle their fragile illusions with just the right amount of carefully chosen truth. By the time the night was over, her carefully constructed image would be irreversibly altered. I wasn't attending as her husband. I was arriving as the consequence she never saw coming. When the night finally arrived, I was more than prepared. I wasn't just physically present. I was mentally locked in, every move planned, every response anticipated. She wanted a flawless evening, a showcase of her curated existence. What she would get instead was a reality check. I stepped into the venue with intent. It was exactly as I had imagined: ornate, pretentious, a monument to fragile self-importance. The lighting was soft, the decor excessive, the drinks absurdly overpriced. The air hummed with conversation, a sea of empty exchanges where everyone pretended they weren't performing, even though they were. And then I spotted her. She was mid-laugh, surrounded by an audience, slipping effortlessly into the role she had spent years perfecting. Her dress was immaculate, her expression effortlessly poised. She hadn't noticed me yet. I could have let her discover my presence on her own, allowed the anxiety to creep in as she realized I had disregarded her warning. But patience wasn't part of the plan. I walked straight toward her. The moment our eyes met, her body went rigid. For a fraction of a second, she looked as if she had seen a ghost. Then, true to form, she recovered. A too bright, too polished smile emerged. "Oh," she greeted, her voice a touch too controlled. "I wasn't expecting you." I returned the smile, slow and deliberate. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Her circle exchanged quick glances, sensing the shift in energy, but unsure of the cause. I watched as she calculated, scrambling for a way to manage the situation before I shattered the illusion she had so carefully crafted. Her fingers wrapped around my arm, pressing just hard enough to convey a silent warning. "We need to talk. Now." I let her lead me away, keeping my expression calm, my stance effortlessly composed. "What the hell are you doing here?" she demanded, her perfect facade cracking for just a moment. I shrugged with casual ease. "Isn't this a public gathering? And besides, I thought it would be nice for us to be seen together, you know, as husband and wife." Her jaw tightened, her eyes darting around, making sure no one could overhear. "You don't belong here. This night is important. I need you to—" "To what?" I interrupted, tilting my head. "Behave? Stay quiet? Avoid embarrassing you?" She didn't answer, but her expression said enough. I leaned in just slightly. "Relax," I whispered. "I promise this night will be unforgettable." Before she could respond, I turned and walked back into the party as if she no longer existed. She had lost control. I moved through the crowd with ease, inserting myself into conversations, but refusing to adhere to their unspoken etiquette. When someone boasted about their latest business venture, I casually asked how much of it was their father's investment. When another guest raved about their luxury vacation, I inquired whether they truly enjoyed it or simply curated it for Instagram. With each exchange, I chipped away at their well-maintained illusions, forcing them to grapple with the reality they pretended didn't exist. Tension in the room began to rise. People grew uneasy, casting uncertain glances at one another, unsettled by someone who refused to follow the script. She lingered nearby, pretending not to watch me, but I could feel her eyes tracking my every move. The panic in her gaze was unmistakable, her mind working overtime to figure out how to contain me. But she was powerless to stop me without making an even bigger spectacle. Then, I raised the stakes. I wove subtle but precise remarks into conversations, statements that, on the surface, seemed innocuous, but carried just enough weight to fracture her reality. I turned to one of her closest friends, a woman she constantly ridiculed in private, and offered a knowing smile. "You wouldn't believe how often she talks about you. Always has so much to say." I let the words settle, allowing the doubt to take root. Then, I shifted my attention to a man she had always been polite to but privately despised. "It's interesting," I mused. "She used to tell me how much you irritated her, but I suppose people change. I wasn't revealing everything. Not yet." No, this was merely the prelude. I wanted the energy in the room to shift, to make people question her long before I delivered the decisive strike. And it was working. Their expressions changed subtly, flickers of something unspoken dancing in their eyes. Low murmurs wove through the gathering like an undercurrent. For years, she had sculpted her image with precision, ensuring that others saw only what she allowed. But tonight, cracks were forming in that carefully crafted illusion, and I was only getting started. At first, the change was nearly imperceptible, a hesitation in their smiles, a glance that lingered a second too long. But I noticed it. The event, once a perfectly curated display of poise and charm, was beginning to unravel. The smooth surface of pleasantries rippled with unease. I moved deliberately through the crowd, scattering small, irrefutable truths like breadcrumbs, each leading straight back to her. There was no need for spectacle or raised voices. That would be overkill. The beauty of it all? I didn't have to lie. A man she had once dismissed as an insistent social climber approached, chuckling as he recounted an old college story. I let him finish, then offered a casual remark. "It's funny. She once told me you were the most determined person she'd ever met, said you'd do whatever it took to be in the right circles." I smiled as if it were a compliment. His laughter faltered, uncertainty flickering in his expression. My wife's head snapped toward me, her grip tightening around her wine glass. A woman she always referred to as a dear friend approached, greeting us with warmth, asking how we were. Before my wife could answer, I spoke first, my voice light with amusement. "She always says you give the best advice. Anytime she's in a tough spot, she tells me, if anyone knows how to turn things in their favor, it's her." For a fraction of a second, the woman's practiced smile wavered before she forced it back into place. I was planting the seeds of doubt, of unease, and my wife knew it. With every passing moment, I could sense her unraveling. Her body tensed, her eyes flitting across the room as if she could contain the damage through sheer will. But I wasn't finished yet. At one point, she seized my wrist, her voice a furious whisper barely restrained. "You need to stop. Right now." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Stop what?" She exhaled sharply, struggling to maintain her composure. "You know exactly what you're doing." I smiled. "Oh, I'm just making conversation, like everyone else." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're tearing everything apart." I leaned in, voice barely above a murmur. No, darling. You did that yourself. I'm just making sure they finally see it. She opened her mouth, but before she could form a response, I turned away, rejoining the gathering. The shift in atmosphere was undeniable now. Glances exchanged, whispered speculations growing bolder. It wasn't outright chaos, not yet, but the admiration she thrived on was slipping through her fingers. Then came the final push. A man she frequently derided in private approached, his tone deceptively light, his eyes sharp with accusation. So, I hear you've had quite a bit to say about me when I'm not around. She stiffened. What? No, that's... Another voice interrupted. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. Then another. And another. The intricate web she had woven over the years was fraying at the seams, unraveling strand by strand, and all I had to do was stand back and watch. The air had changed. This was no longer just polite discontent. It was suspicion, cold, and unrelenting. The whispers grew louder, shifting from curiosity to disbelief, then to outright skepticism. Every conversation circled back to her. The woman who had spent so long building her perfect image now stood in the eye of the storm, watching it all collapse. But I wasn't done yet. I let the weight of it press down on her, let her feel the suffocating realization that control was slipping from her grasp. She tried to recover, laughing too brightly, pulling people aside for hurried explanations, attempting to charm her way back into their favor. But it was futile. She was drowning, and everyone could see it. That's when I decided to end it. I lifted a glass and tapped my fork against it. The crisp chime rang through the room, slicing through the scattered hum of conversation. All eyes turned to me. My wife went rigid. I exhaled slowly, offering a poised smile, the very confidence she had spent years trying to stifle in me. I just wanted to take a moment, I began, my tone calm, deliberate, to acknowledge something important. There were a few nervous chuckles, some uneasy shuffling. My wife's gaze locked onto mine, desperate, silently begging me to stop. I didn't. Tonight is significant, I continued, a chance to reconnect, to celebrate our achievements, to reflect on the past. I met her eyes briefly before turning back to the expectant crowd. But more than anything, it's a night for truth. Silence fell. People were listening now. She inhaled sharply, her grip so tight on her glass I half expected it to shatter. I let the moment linger, let her feel the weight of it. Then I delivered the final blow. Honesty is an odd thing, isn't it? I mused, letting the words settle in the room like an encroaching storm. It's often those who preach it most fervently, who struggle with it the hardest. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. I could see it in their shifting eyes, in the way they stole glances at her, waiting for the inevitable fallout. My wife hesitated, then took a measured step forward. "That's enough," she said, her voice strained. A brittle smile stretched across her face. "Let's not—" I cut her off. "No." She froze. I turned back to the room. "Oh, but we must." The air around us thickened, tense with unspoken truths. "We all know someone like this, don't we?" I continued. "Someone who thrives on deception, who builds relationships not on sincerity but on convenience. The kind who will shower you with compliments, only to dismantle you the moment you're out of earshot." No one spoke, but their silence said everything. I gave a slight nod, acknowledging what we all knew. It's remarkable, really, the effort some people put into sustaining a lie. The way they manipulate, distort the truth, reshape their own narrative, all to create an illusion they hope the world will adore. I turned fully to face her. "But the thing about constructing a false reality," I said, locking eyes with her, "is that sooner or later, the truth catches up." For a moment, everything seemed to suspend in time. Then, the unraveling began. I gestured toward a woman near the back. "She once told me you were her closest friend, that she could always count on you." But I remember how you sighed when she called, how you ridiculed her problems as if they were nothing more than entertainment. The woman's face darkened. My wife's lips parted, but before she could form a defense, I had already turned to another. "And you," I said, addressing a man she had been charming earlier. "She used to say you were insufferable, that she'd rather walk through fire than endure another night listening to your endless monologues about investments." His expression shifted, the mask of politeness cracking. A wave of murmurs swept through the gathering, no longer whispered but voiced in open disbelief. I turned back to her. The color had drained from her face, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as reality sank in. But I wasn't finished. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head as if recalling something particularly painful. And then, of course, there's the greatest lie of them all. The one she told me. Every gaze in the room locked onto us. She said she loved me, that we were equals, that I meant something to her. A humorless chuckle escaped me, void of warmth. But in truth, I was nothing more than a rung on the ladder, a convenience she'd discard the moment I was no longer useful. A sharp inhale from someone in the crowd. She knew where this was heading. I let my gaze drift before settling on a single figure. Then I smiled. "Hey, Adam." A hush fell over the room, so complete it was as if the world had stopped breathing. He stiffened, his entire body tensing. He hadn't expected this, but I made sure he was included. "If you'd like to take it from here," I said casually, "be my guest, because I'm done." And with that, I let the final blow land. The atmosphere grew impossibly heavy, stretching the seconds into eternity as the weight of my words settled. Movements became slow, breaths were held, and my wife, no, my ex-wife, stood there, staring at me as though the ground beneath her had vanished. Because in a way, it had. Her world had collapsed, right before the eyes of those she had spent years trying to impress. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The party had frozen, each guest trapped beneath the magnitude of what had just transpired. I turned, walking toward the door without sparing her another glance. But I could feel it. The desperation in her stance, the panic in her breath, the sheer terror of losing control over the illusion she had so carefully maintained. I had no reason to stay. My work here was finished. As I stepped into the crisp night air, I inhaled deeply. Then, for the first time in years, I smiled. A lightness settled over me, unfamiliar yet welcome. I hadn't realized the weight I had been carrying until it was finally lifted. The exhaustion, the doubt, the endless questioning, it had all dissipated the moment I left that room. As for her, that was another story. I eventually heard what happened after I left. Not from her. She no longer had the privilege of speaking to me. But word travels quickly. The party imploded. People confronted her, demanded explanations, questioned everything she had ever told them. She scrambled, attempted to weave a story that could salvage her image, but the more she spoke, the faster she crumbled. And the truth about people like her? When they start to fall, no one is there to catch them. I imagine she felt it. That sickening realization that the very people she had worked so hard to impress were now turning away. Because that's the flaw of those who build their lives on perception. Once the illusion cracks, it never truly repairs. And the people in that room? They would never see her the same way again. The days that followed were nothing short of merciless. The messages poured in, some laced with barely concealed scorn, others steeped in an eerie, impenetrable silence. Friends who had once been constants in her life now kept their distance, their absence speaking louder than any words ever could. Invitations she had once accepted without a second thought disappeared without a trace, as if they had never existed. The social world she had spent years curating now regarded her as something to be avoided, an untouchable presence lingering at the edges. And the most brutal part. She couldn't refute a single thing. There were no lies, no embellishments on my end. All I did was show them reality, holding up a mirror she could no longer look away from. And the thing about truth? Once it's exposed, it can't be ignored or undone. As for me, I walked away clean, untouched by regret, free of hesitation, entirely devoid of sympathy. I got exactly what I set out for, my divorce. Predictably, she fought tooth and nail to drag it through the mud, flinging baseless accusations, framing herself as the victim, desperate to salvage whatever remained of her standing. But she had nothing left to leverage. No power, no sway, no control. The moment I signed my name on that document, I knew, without a shred of doubt, that it was over. She wanted a life without me, and now she had it. But it wasn't the idyllic, carefully constructed future she had envisioned. It was empty. And the best part? I never had to lift a finger to ruin her. She did it all on her own. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.